I'm here to ask you for a favor. Take these issues seriously. Take these issues very seriously. Right? Because these are real human beings. These are real human agents. These are people that have a right to exist just as much as you do. And within a capitalist society, our social function is created out of our labor and out of our education system. The real opportunity to live a good life within this type of society requires that I have a right to an education, or at least have access to education, and that I have access to labor. I have access to a job. I have the means to support myself. And if you're going to simply say that because your genitals are shaped this way, and you act in a different way, or your genitals were shaped this way at birth, but now they're shaped this way when you're older, that's not a sufficient reason for why we ought to treat people differently. Right? I hope you really do believe that, because if you really do believe that, if society really did believe that, we'd have a very different society than what we see today. Right? We wouldn't have heard about the 4 trans women of the last month in this country that were murdered. By the way, all of them of African American descent. All of them. Right? We would not have to hear about the fact that they were murdered because somebody, a man typically, didn't want them to have a penis, and yet they were sexually attracted to them. And in their eyes, in their mind, that made them gay. And that's not acceptable within a masculine, patriarchal society. Right? I really, really urge you guys to please take these issues seriously. We have 3 individuals that are going to talk, experts in their field. And they're going to give you more data, more than what I've given you up there already at the beginning. Right? They're going to tell you possibly some personal experiences. I'm just asking you, please listen. Take this seriously. A better world is actually possible. And it starts with all of us. It starts with all of us in this room now. All you got to do is change yourself first. Hopefully motivate to change somebody else later. But you have to first change yourself and change your thinking. I could prove to you through logical truth tables if you're in my Phil 6 or Phil 9 classes, right, that I'm right. Gender binary doesn't work. I can prove all that to you. Right? But until you begin to live that way, until you begin to take that rational understanding into your day-to-day life, until that happens, nothing's going to change. Right? And innocent people are going to be harmed, and innocent people are going to be murdered. I don't want to accept the blame shifting that's been going on, that somehow they are responsible for it. They're not responsible for living. Just as you're not responsible because you live. We all have a right to our life, and we all have a right to be authentic. We all have a right to our own authenticity and to live the life that we see ourselves living. To view ourselves with the identity that we view ourselves, not the identities that you tell me I have to live. Right? That's my right. It's my fundamental human right. So, anyways, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over, I think, to Drian, but someone's going to introduce Drian Trish, I think, first. So,
good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and with that, I'd like to introduce our upcoming finalist, Drian Juarez. Drian Juarez is the program manager for the LA Gay and Lesbian Center's Transgender Economic Empowerment Project, a program that empowers transgender people by helping them find employment, develop their professional skills, and thrive in the workplace. Juarez graduated from Otis College of Art and Design with a BA in Fine Arts and began advocating for the transgender community in 2005 as lead health educator for a nonprofit in the West Hollywood area. During this time, she increased her activism by becoming a member of the West Hollywood Transgender Advisory Board and was elected by this group in '09 to design and compose an original poem inscribed on the transgender memorial plaque, the first plaque of this kind in the nation, erected at Matthew Shepard Triangle in West Hollywood. She also became a member of the Transgender Service Provider Network, and in '07 was invited to become a board member of the Female to Male Alliance, an organization started by transgender people for trans people, and the only one in Los Angeles with a 501c3 status. She worked to redesign the mission and vision statement of this local nonprofit to be inclusive of the entire community. This work led to an eventual name change in '09 to Gender Justice LA. In the same year, Juarez was invited to become a member of the Transgender Law Center's Transgender Leadership Council and the Transgender Economic Development Initiative, TD. Juarez was also invited to become a member of the Liberty Hills Funding Board in 2012. Lastly, Juarez was the recipient of the 2010 Trans Unity Trailblazer Award, Minority AIDS Project Trans Geo Divas Community Award in 2011, and graduated from the LGBTQ LAPD Community Police Academy in 2011. Please welcome this prestigious person to this stage.
So I have a little PowerPoint to set up for you. Okay, here we go. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a condensed version of the Gender Identity 101 training I do for most employers and service providers, where we talk about transgender identities, what is transition, how do trans people advocate for their rights, what rights exist within California for trans people. That's generally what I do for employers. For today's training, I decided I would personalize it a little bit and call it My Trans 101. So I'm going to go over sort of what my evolution has been to being the person that I am today. And I'll start off by telling you a little bit about how I identify. So, for me, I identify as a transgender, heterosexual female. I identify as a transgender heterosexual female because I choose not to have SRS, sex reassignment surgery. I love being a transgender woman. I love my body. I love how I experience the world through my body. And it took me a really long time to get to this point of empowerment. For a long time, I didn't feel good about who I was because I didn't see role models of people like myself. I'm an immigrant from Mexico. I immigrated to the States when I was about 5 years old. And prior to that, gender was never an issue for me. I was just this effeminate little child who wanted to be Wonder Woman, who loved wearing pink, and it was never an issue. It wasn't until I immigrated to the States that I started hearing all these new words that I didn't quite understand. Sissy, faggot, I didn't know what all that meant. And I remember coming home to my mother and asking her what these words meant. And I could see it in her face that it wasn't a positive thing. So a lot of the labels that I'll be talking about today exist in the trans community under the transgender umbrella. So under the transgender umbrella, you have identities such as intersexed, cross-dresser. We talk about F to M, M to F, male to female, female to male. We talk about gender and sex being two components of who we are as human beings. We talk about drag queen identities and transsexual identities. So these are just some of the labels that exist under the transgender umbrella. Some people believe that there are far more labels than this. Some people believe that this is enough. The important thing to remember about transgender people is that it's not about figuring out what label works for that person. It's about letting people self-identify. Let people tell you what their life is like, what their preferred pronoun is, what their preferred name is. Let them tell you, rather than assigning somebody an identity. That's the best thing you can do, and that's the best way that you can become an ally to somebody who is either transgender, gender variant, what have you. So, all of these components of who we are exist on these continuums. So all of us have these components. We all have a sex, we all have a gender identity, a gender expression, and a sexual orientation. Now, for most people, when a baby is born, for example, and the doctor says, okay, this baby has a penis, get the blue blanket. Well, it's expected from that point on that that baby will have a gender identity that is masculine, will have a gender expression that is masculine. They like jeans, they like plaid shirts, whatever it is it means to be male in our society, and that they will be attracted to women. So that's what we're talking about with the binary. The same goes for females. When the doctor says, okay, this baby has a vagina, get the pink blanket. It's expected that then that baby will grow up to identify as a girl, that that baby will have a feminine expression, and that they'll be attracted to men. So the heterosexual female model. When I was born, the doctor said, okay, get the blue blanket, you have a baby boy. From that point on, my mother put all these expectations about who I was going to be. I was going to be the boy who carried on the family name, who got married, who gave grandchildren, what have you. All these expectations are put in us as babies about what we're going to be as that male or as that female. It was expected that I would have a masculine presentation. And it was expected that I would grow up to like girls. Little did my family know that I wanted those outfits more than anything. So those are the expectations that are thrown on us once we are born. These ideas of what it means to be male and female are finally assigned to us. Well, for me, when I was born, I would say I identified on the female end of the spectrum. Because I was raised for the first 5 years of my life without any sort of identification of what gender meant, I didn't know that I was different. It wasn't until I got into school that I started hearing words and started experiencing socialization. I started getting called names from primarily the boys. The boys thought that I was weird, that I was a freak, that I was different. I started hearing from teachers that little boys don't want to be Wonder Woman. Little boys can't wear dresses. So very quickly I figured out, oh, okay, so I guess I'm a boy. And oh, okay, I guess I'm different than the other boys. So for a long time, I just felt like the biggest freak in the world. When I was coming out, there was no LGBTQI, what have you. It was just gay, straight, or transsexual. So if you weren't gay or straight, you were a transsexual. So for the longest time, I grew up feeling that the end goal for me was to have sex reassignment surgery, that was what I was supposed to do as a transsexual person. It wasn't until I got to college that I learned for myself that actually there was a rich history of trans identities all throughout time, all throughout history. And I especially love the Native American idea of the two-spirited individual, somebody who embodies both masculine and feminine qualities. And this person was seen as the shaman, the healer, the person who would bridge communities. So for me, that was a really beautiful understanding of what I was feeling, that I was meant to be a transgender woman, that there was nothing wrong with me, that this is just who I was meant to be, but our society has turned that identity into something that is negative. Because it doesn't fit into the binary, it's seen as bad, as freakish, as wrong. So for me, I, for the longest time, thought I was just like the other girls, but I learned I was very different. I was always an effeminate child. I wanted to look like my aunts and my cousins. And because I was a very feminine child, that was the issue with me. That was why I was getting beat up. I experienced a lot of bullying. And oftentimes, this is the point where a lot of trans people start having a disadvantage. Because we get bullied, because we get picked on, we don't want to go to school. We don't want to take extra activities. We don't want to be around other people because they hurt us. And oftentimes that is detrimental to us because then we don't have the same access to education, to services, to social experiences that most people do. And oftentimes, at the center, we have a pt shelter for youth. A lot of the youth that we see are transplants from other states who have been completely abandoned by their family once they come out as LGBT. Their families no longer want to have anything to do with them because now they are not living up to that expectation of what their family thought they were going to grow up to be. So instead of embracing that child for who they are rejecting that child for not living up to the standards that they thought that child should live up to. So for me, the only way I could find any sort of community, any sort of connection to empowerment was by embracing this sort of difference that I was. I became more gothic. I became a club kid. I started, hanging out with the people who hung out in the back of the high school smoking. That was my way of connecting with people, by embracing sort of this anti-culture sort of identity. My orientation has always been to men. This was one of my school friends who I had the biggest crush on. For as long as I can remember, I always saw myself as the mommy, this very stereotypical idea of what it meant to be a woman. I was the one who was going to stay home, who was going to have babies, who was going to wait for the husband to get home. At 5, 6, this was just my idea of who I was, of what I was supposed to be. And as I evolved and changed and sort of grew into the person that I was, one of the things that I had to go through that unfortunately, I think is a rite of passage for so many of, especially my trans Latina sisters, is the street economy, doing sex work. That was really the only way that I could access transition. I was lucky enough to go to college, I had a degree, I was working in the fashion industry in an entry-level job that didn't pay that much, and on top of that, my insurance benefits exclusively excluded any of my transitional related care. So my insurance said that it would not cover hormones, that it would not cover visits to endocrinologists. So I had to figure out a way to transition. Even though I was androgynous and people didn't know whether I was male, female, they didn't know what pronoun to use with me, that was not an identity that I was comfortable with. I feel myself to be more on the feminine end of the spectrum. I use female pronouns, I identify as female, even though my body is different than most women, I would say. And that's sort of the work that I do now. I help people repair that damage that they experienced as youth. Oftentimes the clients that I deal with are dealing with drug addiction, homelessness, bouncing from bad relationship to bad relationship because they never got to build those positive connections to family, to friends, to community, simply because of their gender variance. So oftentimes this is the point where we can experience so much damage that it really makes it difficult for us to succeed as adults, to be able to socialize with people. A lot of trans people oftentimes experienced social awkwardness because we didn't have that experience of being able to go to prom with who we wanted to, being able to date who we wanted to. Our connections to people are sometimes damaged, and our ability to connect with people is sometimes a little bit more difficult. Now, this is sort of how I feel. I feel like the goddess. I feel I embrace both masculine and feminine. I feel that this is my rite of passage. This is who I was meant to be. I was meant to see the world through masculinization, and now I'm seeing the world through feminization. I get to see the world by the gender lens that affects all of us. And as a trans person, that transition is something that is profound. Oftentimes we think that transition is just us, it's just me, I'm the one who's changing. But oftentimes transition is about changing our families, changing our relationships, changing our friends, changing our social circles. Gender is such an ingrained component of who we are as people, of how we live our life, that when you make such a big change, it can't help but have ripple effects on your life, on your work, on how you relate to people. And for me now, I feel that it's really important to just let people be. Sometimes when I do this training, I'll hear people who have a new word for defining who they are, how they live their life. And again, the important thing is to remember to validate people's identities, validate their pronouns, validate how they want to live their life. Maybe you don't understand it, maybe it's not exactly like yours, but it's about breaking that heterocentric idea that everyone has the same lives that we do, that everyone has the same experience as we do. We don't. We all have very different ways of being who we are as human beings. And so the most important thing that you can do to be an ally to the trans community is to open up your hearts and minds to the idea that people, that human beings, go way beyond labels, that we go way beyond any prescribed idea of being or living, that we are creatures that are here to absorb the world, to explore it in its many, many forms and diverse ways. And the best thing that we can do, I think, in my opinion, to live a full life is to open ourselves up to that experience of being a human being, instead of putting labels and barriers against who we are or who we are not, embracing the fact that we are all human beings at the core. So that's a little bit of how gender, sex, gender identity all work and how they affect our identities. And so for me, that was just something I wanted to leave you with so that you get an idea of how all of our identities can shift and change as we grow, as we age, as we change. And the best thing you can do to accept someone is to, again, let them self-identify, let them tell you what their lives are like, let them tell you what pronouns, what names they prefer, and to have an open mind to people's varying identities. So that was it for me. So thank you so much for being here today.
Dr. Kegel has recently received her dissertation focused in the experience of individuals in the LGBTQ community.